Yeah.
That's what it is.
I feel like if you're just
Yeah.
someone who's existed on the internet in a professional capacity too, like now
Right.
everybody uses their Facebook feed and are kind of inundated with everyone in their network's political opinions, but just like anybody who did stuff that may have streamed online or,
Yeah.
when I used to do my old show, we posted things on YouTube. Like that was a really rough and brutal, but very like real introduction to the world and to what was out there and how people were feeling and, call them trolls, but they exist and they vote.
And they lead.
Yeah, sadly.
And they're president. So you got your start on RT, right?
I did, yeah.
Can you deem? I mean, I used to go down there back in the day too. I think, but what can you demystify? Criticize whatever you think. But I feel like I saw Sheldon Whitehouse in a hearing on Russian interference in the election, and I think RT, like many other networks, does a fair amount of garbage programming. There's no doubt. But I was a little disturbed because he had this chart where it was things that if they're true are really serious things. Bribing somebody or hacking a voting machine or whatever. And then there was also RT. I was like, you really gonna equate a global satellite network, which totally is a Russian propaganda PR effort, but it's a radically different thing than illegally intervening in an election. Just like us supporting a coup overseas is different than funding Voice of America. It might be part of the same continuum in some ways, but that ain't the same thing.
Yeah, it's funny because I get asked shockingly a lot to comment on RT these days, and
I did a cliche. Huh? I'm sorry.
No, I don't mean it like that. I'm happy to talk about it, but
Yeah.
my experience there. Oh, thanks for offering me a beer.
There is a beer. Do you want a beer?
Yeah, I want a beer.
All right, let's get the woman a beer.
Bunch of guys in the room. No one offers me a drink.
Oh. Well, I think you'll find. Yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump for re-election.
No.
Yeah,
I worked there from the very end of 2008. I started in kind of the end of December until 2012. So I came in when there were 5 people in the Washington, D.C. bureau. And then within the first 6 months, they went through this massive expansion. They opened a huge studio that they have now. And it became this really kind of flashy, huge professional looking. Thank you very much. Miller High Life.
Miller High Life. I took the last Heineken. Cheers.
This huge production within 6 months when I was there. But that was also an interesting time to work there because it was when Obama first was in his office for his first term, when Dmitry Medvedev was the president and, kind of the seat filler for Vladimir Putin for one term. Yeah, or however you guys want to say it, you Americans.
Dominic Medvedev.
And it was this kind of rosy time. It was New START treaty and reset in U.S.-Russian relations.
Right.
And I don't think that that's a bad thing to hope for.
Not
somebody
at all.
who doesn't want us to enter a new Cold War or
Right.
be on the brink of, nuclear disaster. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But
that seems great.
RT in and of itself, I think that they were very straightforward right from the beginning, which was saying that they wanted to portray the kind of the Russian viewpoint on the world, right? They felt that the media was completely controlled by a Western perspective and a Western outlook, and here was Russia's kind of entrance onto that stage. They at first started, with just content about Russia.
Right.
Then the DC bureau where I worked, RT America, my show focused on U.S. domestic politics. I mean, we did foreign policy too, but I wasn't. It was an American show, an
You did just
American
a
political
smart, whenever I saw it, and correct me if I'm, it was just this is just a smart, progressive kind of show. Not even, I won't even say I guess progressive in the sense that there was a willingness to take on issues that are called progressive just because they're kind of usually only covered by progressive outlets, but they shouldn't.
I mean, I just called it liberal.
Yeah, liberal.
But it was
whatever.
to me, it was a liberal talk show.
Yeah.
We covered the stories that now I think have become a little more part of the mainstream. But at the time, no one else really wanted to be talking about, Chelsea Manning and Guantanamo Bay and civil liberties and drone strikes and internet freedom. Aaron Schwartz used to come on our show all the time, and they were kind of fringe topics at the time. And so our whole thing was railing against what the mainstream was missing and covering those stories that we really wanted to put out there. And, it's funny because the lineup of guests that we had on my show are people that you'll see all over TV now, and they're reporters in other places. But I will also say that I think my show was an exception, and I don't say that to like toot my own horn.
Yeah.
Just it was
Emoji. Yeah.
I think that there's, like you said, a lot of garbage material that can be found on RT. And something that they did in the very beginning when the channel was trying to find its legs was kind of buy into some of the like conspiracy 9/11 theory stuff. And we didn't cover any of that at
Right.
all. And I feel like when I worked there was like a big staff. I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, but like people didn't want to be doing that kind of coverage,
so just,
and they made
just
it
out
very
of curiosity,
clear. Yeah.
who do you think did 9/11?
Let's not go there.
Yeah,
No.
oh, okay, yeah, no,
I'm kidding.
Doesn't melt steel beams.
But now, like, I
yeah.
don't watch RT anymore. From what I've seen, it seems like they're kind of veering back into the conspiracy stuff, but now they're doing it by tapping into the like alt-right.
They're in that alt-right
thing,
zone.
yeah.
More. I mean, I had two thoughts about. I mean, one, I remember because I went on RT just when I was starting to do stuff like this, basically 2013, and it was this weird like. I'd see a lot of segments that were like, oh, that's just a really good piece of coverage on a drone strike that killed a wedding party in Yemen, and no one else is going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And then there was,
And then
others.
you see like Wayne Madsen on.
Yeah. Then
I don't
you
know
all
if anybody knows
yeah,
who Wayne
you'd be
Madsen
like-
is, but he was like a contributor for RT who was peddling, all kinds of nonsense all the time.
Right. You had this, but I was wondering, like, and then I think, like, now it has more clearly gone in that kind of, like, more alt-right conspiracy direction. But I was wondering, like, so, Al Jazeera, I think, does, and I actually have, like, Mike Hanna, I have him on. I do a lot of stuff with him. He's a Al Jazeera contributor. Like, Al Jazeera does some incredibly, really high-quality programming. And when I would go on Al Jazeera, like, it has a much more kind of like stuffy sort of like UK kind of feel about it. But on the other hand, like there's no doubt that every network has, when you saw the way they covered Egypt versus the way they covered Bahrain during the Arab uprisings, like it's very obvious what their sort of very subtle slant is. So I'm wondering is there innate value in like maybe every perspective on the world in terms of just even like blocks, like a Eurozone perspective, a Russian perspective, our American corporate perspective, this sort of, Middle East African. Maybe there's innate value to having that on. And that's one question. And the second question I'm just wondering is like, why did RT, like, they had people like you. They had plenty of people. And they also have like those District Sentinel guys who did a lot of great people.
Yeah, they still have, Tom Hartman is
they
still
do
there.
Tom Hartman, right? So they have this, like, they could actually, if they went all in on that, I think it would be like, oh, that's a really high quality network that has like a particular slant, like everybody else does. But then there was always this other track of like, we should also get this other guy who like, thinks that at like the bottom of the Vatican, there's like a, some type of like Pizzagate tape or something.
That's what makes it so interesting
Fun.
and such a mystery to so many people, I think,
Right.
though, is that it's not easy to quantify RT. And I think that a lot of the hit pieces and critical pieces that are written about it don't have any nuance,
No.
and they just make an assumption. They're like, oh, they played a couple pieces that were about conspiracy theories, or they did a couple things praising Trump, and then they say that
Right.
is what the blanket coverage on the network is, and it's not. And, and that's, I think, what kind of freaks people out is they're like, oh, shoot, because they have a little something for everybody, and they have people doing really good journalism, and then they have some really bad, really crazy stories. And so it's hard to just put your finger on it. But that said, I mean, I absolutely think that it has the right to exist.
Yeah, of course.
As a
Yeah.
media organization. And what was your first question? Oh, about different points of view. So I think that that's something that we desperately need, in this world.
Totally. And also I should add Telesur too. Like
Yeah.
we need Telesur, we need a Latin American. Like those center, like even just the notion that like it's centered on Moscow or it's centered on, Qatar or Caracas versus Washington, London, or New York, which is like basically like the city engine of like all of these global news networks. There's innate value in that, I think.
But I mean, and the other thing is,
Yeah.
it's not like I wasn't presenting the Russian perspective. Tom Hartman, Ed Schultz are not presenting the Russian perspective. But in general, I think that that's something that we need in this country. And I've written about it, as too, is that like I think by virtue of being the superpower in the world, we have taken for granted our position, and we're not interested in what's happening in the rest of the world. We're not interested in putting ourselves in anyone else's shoes, and I think that that's really detrimental when it comes to our foreign policy, right? I mean, you have to be able to understand other countries, other perspectives, understand the political dynamics of what's happening there domestically before we make any educated decisions on how to approach countries, right, or how to strategically deal with them. And like we're just Americans are just not open, and I think that's because we've been kind of like fed this exceptionalism message. Not that America isn't a great and a wonderful and amazing country, but if we just think that we're exceptional rather than acknowledge that we are also dysfunctional, that's why we never get anywhere. That's why we live in denial about what we're doing wrong. That's why, other countries can call us out for our hypocrisy. That's why we kind of go into certain situations with our eyes closed. And I think that that's very much, I'm totally veering off into, another tangent here now, but I think that if you look at the kind of freak out over Russian election interference and Donald Trump being president, we still, as a country, haven't come to terms with why Donald Trump is president.
Right.
And sure, Russia may have had something to do with that, but it's also just like this deflection to assume that like, oh, all the problems are coming from the outside in rather than there's rot, right here at home.
Well, actually, we talk about this a lot, and Matt makes this point a lot, which is really essential. Like, even if you took seriously or literally like all of the kind of elements of like how was Facebook manipulated by Cambridge Analytica and all this stuff that people get into, to the extent that that stuff is real, which I think it is real to some extent, it is far more threatening and dangerous and of a continuum with things like voter suppression inside domestic American politics and inside what turned this election for Trump. The way these things are utilized by a family like the fucking Mercers than the Russian government. And it is very odd. Again, and I think on the other hand, there's this other real extreme that you get in America, which is totally marginal in the mainstream, but has more air in our, at least, kind of more left spaces where it's like, Russia's just like this aggrieved upholder of international law, and Putin's just trying to kind of like smooth everything over. And I think that's a diluted perspective as well. But this bizarre need that, Hillary Clinton's like the obvious example of the week, to like center Russia over these things that, as you're alluding to, are like way more difficult for us to deal with, like racism, like inequality, like voter suppression, like private companies manipulating data to sway voter behavior, like there's no laws governing, there's some rudiments of sort of campaign finance laws and oversight for television advertising. There's nothing analogous as we move into this world of, analytics and sort of micro-targeting. All of those things are really complicated and implicate where we're at, but we want to get to Russia. And I just like, do you think there's something specific about Russia that makes everybody in America dumb? Or is that just like how we roll? Because I feel like when Russia comes up, and I'm telling you this like from... there were moments in that Oliver Stone documentary with Vladimir Putin where I was like, dude, like,
I still haven't watched that.
Out of your fucking mind, right? Like, and that's on the big picture. That's unimportant. Like, any marginal thing, I think, like, yes, like overall, it's a good idea to soothe relations and have arms control agreements with Russia, and everything else. On the other hand, I think like what Russia is doing in Syria is fucking atrocious, as are what the Gulf states are doing, as are what we are doing, right? You can have a sort of integrated perspective. And then, watching like this Clinton world turn into almost like going back to their childhoods, where it's like the hide under the desk and their inner analytics. And it's like, well, actually, you know what? Some of the wealthiest families in America that would essentially like to drastically pare back democracy and legally entrench plutocracy or inner analytics. So why aren't you talking about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
Yeah,
so
there's
much
a lot
there.
there. Take anyone you want. Take anyone you want. I had to rant a
No,
little bit.
I mean, it's a question that I've been trying to explore too, because for someone like myself, I was born in '86. My family and I moved from the Soviet Union in 1990. Grew up in the United States, but I wasn't, a child of the Cold War because
Right.
already by the time I had, any ability to think about things critically and analytically, we weren't in the Cold War anymore. And
Right.
so I feel like on one hand, yes, we have in power people who did grow up during that time and whose, entire outlook very much was shaped by that, kind of global conflict. And so they're carrying it over into now, where there has to be this like natural antagonism between the two countries. And it's being used in Russia too. I mean,
Absolutely. Right.
Putin as someone who's, part of the Soviet system or comes from the Soviet system is very much using the same kind of anti-Americanism. And that works with a lot of older people, in Russia who miss the Soviet system as well, because there are a lot of them. There are a lot of people who really miss the Soviet Union and like centralized government that just took care of everything for you. But it's unfortunate to me that now that's kind of like seeping into a younger generation. And I don't know why it is. I mean, I think there's a million reasons, but you'd think that people would be able to not immediately kind of like have a knee-jerk reaction that's so like warmongery, and like the second you hear Russia, it just makes you go, ooh. And like you think of villains and boogeymen.
Gift that. Like, ooh. I like that. All right.
I always say, because I went to Moscow this summer and I felt like when I came back and I would tell people like, I just got back from Moscow, everyone would be like their eyes would go kind of wide, as if it was like, oh, are you sure you want to be telling me that? As if it was a bad thing that I even traveled to Russia. How dare you? Oh, I went to a store before.
Can you, I'm sorry, not to be awkward. Can you leave, please?
I went to a store to buy my niece a gift in Park Slope, some like toy store, before I left because she wanted a Minion stuffed animal. And I was explaining it to the store clerk, who, to be fair, was an older woman. I said, I'm bringing this to my niece in Moscow. And she was like, Moscow? Why is she in Moscow? And I was like, well, she lives there. My brother, my niece, my mom live there, my grandmother. And she just kind of stares at me wide-eyed and goes, by choice. I couldn't believe it. I was so shocked. But I don't know. Anyway, that was neither here nor there, that story.
No,
I apologize.
it's right. This young woman called the Majority Report when I was hosting, and she got invited to sound like a really interesting conference. I forgot where. Sochi, right? And she was like, well, first of all, like, and I think they both listen to this show, so like all love as I say this, that apparently the mom was like, you can call Michael or Sam, and depending on what they say, like, will influence. And I was like, okay, I'm like totally not. Because first of all, like, I make absolutely reckless travel decisions. Like, I'll pretty much go anywhere. So, like, I'm not a good gauge of that. And then number two, like, I'm just not a good gauge of that. But with all those caveats, I did say, I was like, well, I mean, you should look it up. But I have just never heard anywhere that, like, traveling to Russia as, like, a student or anything is, like, in any way a problem. And I looked it up after, and someone actually emailed the show, and they were like, oh, I have a friend who goes once a year, and it's great, and it's like their favorite place to travel. And I was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like, there isn't really a reason to think that if you're just, like, flying to Russia, you're going to, like, get stuffed in the back of, like, a black car or something. It was like, no, but it's in the imagination.
Yeah, really but I think I will also say I think Hollywood has a lot to do with it. Right. I mean, we have been fed movies and
Jason
TV
Bourne
shows.
movies.
Yeah, or but even like since my childhood, and then I felt like post 9/11. Then it started kind of switching off between either the Russians or like a brown guy being the bad guy in the movie.
And
it was like Russians or Muslims. It was like always the only two options.
But occasionally you'd have Russians who'd be like, so now you see why we have to kill all of them. The CIA guy would be like, oh, you guys are so tough. It's not how we do things. But I'll take the intel.
All of that affects us though, right? I mean, if we're talking about people seeing ads on Facebook or, certain tweets and whatever, then we're just as much affected by what we see on TV, what we hear on the radio. And it's kind of just, becomes ingrained in our system. And the same way that you see politicians like Donald Trump or like Vladimir Putin, anybody, using the other to blame things on, whether it be immigrants or refugees or Muslims and, people on welfare, whoever's taking things away from you, which is
Chechens.
The message that he's always trying to send.
Yeah.
Then I think that the kind of the Russia-America dynamic works in the same way there. And also, it's to Russia's benefit, it's to Vladimir Putin's benefit to kind of keep that alive because he very much wants to have Russia be an important player on the world stage.
Right.
And they've wanted that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is to kind of return to glory in a certain sense. And so he has done that in bringing stability and convincing Russian people that Russia is important. And they're creating BRICS and with Brazil and India and China and South Africa,
Right.
to try to show that there is an alternative to the kind of Western system and Western dominance, be it economic or political, in the world. And I think that has a little something to do with his popularity at home too. I mean, nationalism works in Russia just as much as it works here, or patriotism.
And it's resurgent. I mean, that's
too.
another thing to me. That's a more interesting question. Like, what is the global pattern? It's not the same thing, but of course, there's an overlap between Trump and Putin and Duterte and Erdogan and Modi. Like, that's a much more interesting pattern than, this sort of tail chasing about. But that said, I mean, before we get to Trump at the UN, do you have like a snapshot? Like this, my basic read on the Russia story is that there probably is some type of connection between Trump and basically mafia figures who might be connected with certain aspects of, Russian intelligence services or whatever. And that Trump being who he is, I think if Trump was president during 9/11, he might try to take a loan from the Bin Laden group to refinance a hotel, right? This dude will fucking do they're involved. I mean, they're great builders. It's true, right? He'll do anything. So I think there's something there. I don't think it's and then there was the Donald Jr. meeting and all this stuff. I don't think it's Manchurian Candidate, and I also don't think it's some people have this insistence that it's absolutely nothing, and to even acknowledge, which I think it's sort of its own kind of dumb position. But anyway, what's your basic read on what is that? Is there a Russia thing? Is it a delusion? Is it a fantasy? Is it an actual thing that's been overblown, or is it actually oh fuck, they really got in on this? Probably the way we get in on them too, to the extent we can.
I mean, first of all, I have no, insight or no kind of no intelligence that anyone else isn't aware of. So let me just start with that. And so everything I say is just based on the reports that I've read on speculation.
Yeah, of course.
But I think, listen, it seems very clear, right, that Russia did do something in terms of trying to manipulate and influence public opinion in the United States. That, though, in and of itself, to me, is part of a much larger problem that we, again, aren't really addressing, which is acknowledging how much people are influenced by everything that they see and read and hear. Right. And now that we're so oversaturated with content that you can get from a million different sources, we need to figure out how to get people to want to believe in truth again, because nobody wants to believe in facts and nobody knows who to believe. And so that's what perpetuates I think the spread of fake news and things like that. And so that's, again, some soul searching that we have to do.
Right.
That, that isn't just a Russia problem.